In 1995 with Michael Ignatieff, and in accordance with the philosopher's wishes, they're being shown only now, after his death last week.
I saw a man, pale man, struggling. A lot of people went over to dragged him down from some top of a house from which he was presumably sniping, and obviously leading him to a very disagreeable fate. And to see a single man struggling with a lot of people dragging him to what was obviously his death is something which remained with me forever and gave me a distaste for terrorism or violence, which remains with me to this day, no matter where it comes from, no matter how justified it might be thought to be.
As a boy of 7, Isaiah Berlin witnessed the Russian Revolution. Arguably the greatest liberal political philosopher of the 20th century, he was also present at some of the century's turning points and met many of its greatest figures: Wittgenstein, Virginia Woolf, Eisenstein, Churchill, and Kennedy. He once wrote, "A fox knows many things, but a hedgehog knows one big thing." He was a hedgehog, all his work a defense of liberty, a plea on behalf of that frightened face in the crowd. Berlin belonged to the generation of British thinkers and broadcasters who became household names in the 1950s and 60s, A.J.P. Taylor, A.J. Ayer, and Hugh Trevor Roper. But unlike these others, he was an émigré intellectual, both a quintessentially English member of the intellectual establishment and an outsider, his preoccupations rooted in his childhood years as a Jew growing up in the former Russian Empire. He was born in 1909 in Riga, in Latvia, then a province of the Russian Empire. The only child of a wealthy timber merchant, he and his family belonged to the uppermost reaches of the Jewish bourgeoisie. They'd long since left the cultural world of the Jewish ghetto, and they were thoroughly assimilated. The Berlins lived in an Art Nouveau-style apartment building in one of the most fashionable streets in Riga. As a child, young Isaiah was taken for walks in a nearby park where veterans of the Crimean War sat and took the sun. He remained in temperament and culture a Russian Jew of the last century, the last great Jewish intellectual of Tsarist Russia. In 1916, the Berlins fled advancing German armies and moved to Petrograd, later to become Leningrad, and now St. Petersburg. His experience of the 1917 revolution and of the hardship that followed under the Bolsheviks inoculated him forever against the Soviet system. All his writing can be read as a defense of the individual against the violence of the crowd and the dogma of the party line. 2 years after the revolution, the Anglophile Berlins left Russia for England. Two central elements of the young Isaiah's identity, Russian and Jewish, were in place. Now a third crucial element was to be added: his Englishness. The Berlins came to England in 1920 and settled in Surbiton in Surrey. Isaiah's love of England was colored by the moment when he first encountered it. It was the England of Kipling, King George, the gold standard, and empire. If the English took to him, it was because he offered them back an émigré's version of their favorite myths.
How much English do you speak when you arrive?
I knew Daisy, Daisy, give me your answer true. I am half crazy, all for the love of you. It won't be stylish marrieds. I can't afford a carriage, I would pronounce it. but you look sweet upon the seat of a bicycle made for two. That I knew by heart. I knew the word bicycle, therefore. I knew about 40 other English words. The first thing I did on arrival, in the morning, when we were given a delicious dish of eggs and bacon, which my family consumed without the slightest self-consciousness. So that religion...
Pretty spectacular violation of kosher laws to have bacon.
It evaporated by then. They're both what's called emancipated. Later, my mother changed back to old habits, but at that time, she was perfectly free.
What did you do when you arrived?
I played God Save the King with one key on the piano, one finger. It indicated the early diversion to the new life.
You come as a complete stranger, a foreigner, without any English,
Right.
to an English school,
To a very English school.
in suburban Surrey.
Correct.
And very quickly, you get on. How can you account for your ability to swim in this new world?
I'm a natural assimilator. I think I'm naturally assimilate myself, adjust myself to milieus in which I live. This may be due to having to sort of be bundled out of one country into another. I can't explain it. All I can say is that I began playing football and cricket quite soon in the school league and quite enjoyed it.
When do you think you felt really at home in English? How long did that take?
I don't think I could have felt totally home in English in my first year. Although I did take part in the Christmas play of my school, which was Babies in the Wood. I was second murderer, and all I was made to say was, I'm a-comin', I'm a-comin'. I said that.
What was it like to be an only child? It must have been a bit suffocating to be inside that cocoon.
It should have been, and maybe it was, but I don't remember it as suffocating. It is true that when I went to Oxford and was free of my family and lived by myself in a college, I felt liberated from something.
You then go to St. Paul's School through the 20s.
Remember, I have very little imagination.
What?
I don't regard myself as very imaginative, and I don't think the English are very imaginative. And so it fitted quite well.
You have your feet firmly planted on the ground.
Without knowing it, I think.
Yes.
The ground is firm, my feet are firm, but I'm not aware of being planted firmly. I'm not aware of the possibility of flying.
Berlin went up to Oxford in 1928 at the end of the Brideshead era. It was an Oxford dominated by the male public school ethos, by unquestioned class privilege, and by a rather precious ideal of gentility. For the privileged few, it was still an age of innocence. The crash and the dirty 30s still seem far away.
The image one has of Oxford is very much set by Brideshead Revisited. It's a kind of fabled world. Now, what exactly is this Oxford that you come up to in 1928? Give me a sense of the atmosphere.
I have no contact with the Evelyn Waugh's Oxford. And therefore this jolly Oxford of drunken, homosexual, adventurous characters, all this is entirely foreign to me.
What about the aesthetes? What does that mean?
I'll give you an example of an aesthete. The first aesthete I met, I saw that he was because he had his hair done in a peculiar way and his face was slightly painted, rouged in some way. I said to him, what is your name? My name is Francois Capel. His name is Frank Curtis. He's son of a colonel in Malta. I said to him, what college are you at? He said, my dear, I simply can't remember.
What about the Hearties?
And they hated these seats, and these seats feared them. And from time to time, they set upon these seats and beat them up. And these seats, as a form of self-protection, you sometimes require lavatory chains, which wound round your arm with a knob. Once you unwound it, it became a defensive weapon of considerable effectiveness.
The aesthete-Hearty distinction in that world really disappears after 31, after the crash.
That is
And then
so.
Oxford, the whole undergraduate milieu changes greatly in the 30s. Can you describe what that change is?
Yes, I can tell you. The reason for this is this. In order to be in, you have to have rather expensive clothes. You count on having £400 a year for life. Well, that's what your parents will give you. There were no East seats from grammar schools. When that crisis came, the parents suddenly couldn't count on giving their children £400 a year.
The Depression of 31.
The Depression of 31.
Right.
It created a crisis in the anticipated income of quite a large number of persons in England. Whether they lost money or not, they were afraid of losing it. Their children were told that the income would have the pocket money, the large sums pocket money would have to stop.
Is Oxford then much more political and much more
Yes.
politicized
They
through
all
the
take-
rest of the 30s?
In 31, they could turn up in flannel trousers and sports jackets, not these exquisite Paris perfected clothes. And the whole atmosphere changed.
One of the people that you meet, I think, in early 33, who you revered as an artist, was Virginia Woolf. And I'm just,
True.
What do you recall about meeting her, and why did it make such an impression on you?
I met her at lunch with the warden of New College, Mr. Fisher. She was very beautiful, to start with. One of the most beautiful women I've ever seen in my life. She had light blue eyes and rather wandering like a gypsy's. She had an exquisite figure. She could be said to look like a kind of idealized governess. I mean, that towards which governors may wish to aspire, but never get to. She had a silvery voice, as you would imagine, and she talked marvelously in images.
About
But
what?
really,
Can you give me an idea of what she's...
anything, well, I'll tell you. I'll give a reproduction conversation. Well, this doesn't come into it. Fisher said to her, Virginia, do you read novels, other people's novels? She said, well, sometimes. She said, what about Scott? Do you ever read Scott? No, I think it's rubbish. There was silence. Then he said, do you walk in the country much? Yes, I do, sometimes. What do you find most interesting when you look out, when you look at the right and left, when you walk? I think I like the goats very much. Why? Because they look so ecclesiastical. And she looked at me. I don't think I uttered a single word. But she wrote a letter, about 2 letters, about me. One to her sister, Vanessa, and one to my nephew, Quentin Bell, on the same day.
I spent a night with the Fishers at the warden's lodgings. Oh, dear, what a farce. There was the great Isaiah Berlin, a Portuguese Jew by the look of him, Oxford's leading light, a communist, I think, a fire-eater. I had the usual undergraduate talk and argued with Isaiah, who was very clever, much too clever, like Maynard in his youth, a violent Jew.
Berlin never faced outright anti-Semitism in England, though he never forgot that he was an outsider. But he was also a rising intellectual star, one of the coming young philosophers in Oxford. In 1932, he was the first Jew to be elected to All Souls, and only the 3rd Jew ever to be appointed a Fellow of an Oxford college.
I never for a moment thought that I would be taken. Partly because I was Jewish. They certainly had no Jews for me. And I had a feeling that it's the kind of college which probably wouldn't take someone quite as eccentric in origin. Russian, foreign, Jewish, not that type, I thought.
But what's astonishing or interesting or significant about All Souls is that it's a junction point between
Yes, I'll
Oxford
tell you.
life and
the outer world.
British establishment.
Let me explain. My first term in All Souls, 1932, the first man I met was Sir John Simon, who at that time was Foreign Secretary, who said to me, I think there's going to be a commission on India, of which I'm going to be a member. If you have any thoughts about India, would you write them on a postcard and let me know? I took him seriously. I didn't do it. I thought he meant it. He couldn't possibly have done. I then met Geoffrey Dawson, who was editor of the Times, and a very, very influential figure in the Conservative Party.
So you're barely in your early 20s, and you meet at one fell swoop through All Souls the key figures of the British establishment, the political life in the 30s.
If you were in those in the 30s, you could discover very easily how England was run, who were the important people, because these people came to the old school and talked freely, and they brought guests with them of equal importance. And in the evenings, people sat round a fire and had arguments. The junior fellows, senior fellows, the Londoners, non-Londoners. It was full of political life.
The resolution reads that this House will in no circumstances fight for its king and country. Those in favour, please signify.
In the darkening political climate of the late 30s, Britain was divided over how to deal with the growing threat from Hitler and Mussolini. Many of the leading appeasers, Sir John Simon, Lord Halifax, and Geoffrey Dawson, were fellows of All Souls, and they'd come down to Oxford at weekends and defend the policy of making a deal with the dictators against their young critics, including Berlin.
What these people above all thought about was the Soviet Union, and they feared communism more than anything else. And they thought that Hitler, though rather awful, and the Nazis, though rather awful, were a shield against Russia, which was worse, more dangerous to the British Empire and to them. Let me tell you a story which you won't hear from anyone else. Sir John Simon was Foreign Secretary in 1935. During the Italian-Abyssinian War, we, the young fauve
Of All Souls,
gathered around him and said, why don't you impose oil sanctions on Italy, which was then talk. Sanctions were imposed, but not oil sanctions, because that might have crippled. He said, you young people want me to impose oil sanctions on Italy. Supposing I do, Mussolini may fall. And then what? Communism? That story never got out of school.
Now, you are fiercely anti-communist, but you're on the left.
Yes.
You pack parcels for Spain and things.
I'm not very political, but so far as I have views.
What do you mean you're not very political?
Well, because I was never interested in politics as such, in spite of being professor of it. Politics were not at the center of my thought. The center of my thought was literature, the arts, and people.
Why do you think this pattern of avoiding political commitment emerges in you? What is it about you?
I don't think I avoided it. I simply didn't have it. I just wasn't terribly interested, because I wasn't interested in day-to-day events. I was more interested in what might be called, it sounds a very conceited thing to say, in the more permanent aspects of the human world. I mean, such as art or literature, not the daily papers. It might be called, it sounds a very conceited thing to say, in the more permanent aspects of the human world. I mean, such as art or literature, not the daily papers. Not this sort of, except for my Zionism. That was a genuine political movement, and that I was devoted to and conscious of, always.
Almost unnoticed by the world, a new Jerusalem has been arising outside the ancient walls. A new Palestine in the land of promise. Over an area of some 500 square miles, Jews from all over the world have been bringing about a miracle in the desert.
As a Jew, Berlin opposed appeasement, but his attitude to his own Jewishness was complicated. He was both thoroughly assimilated into English life and a lifelong Zionist, devoted to the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. His own roots were now in England, but he never forgot what it was to feel homeless, to be without a state of your own. This insight made him the only liberal philosopher of the 20th century with sympathy for the longings and passions of nationalism.
When did you first go to Palestine?
1934.
And what impression did it make on you? Did you feel that here you were in a place where Jews were at home?
I was deeply moved, deeply moved. When we entered the train from, I think, Kantara east, which was the east side of the Suez Canal, to Jerusalem. And a Jewish ticket collector came in to check our tickets and talked Hebrew to some other man who was with him. I was profoundly moved. That was the experience of a really unique kind. I said it was possible. And there was a country in which these people function normally, in spite of the fact that the British officials, almost all, were against them.
Does Zionism become a political commitment in the 30s, or is it something you imbibe, as it were, with your mother's milk?
I worked this out for myself. I was self-converted.
How did it happen?
My reason for Zionism is very simple. Jews were a minority in every country they were in. I didn't know of a single Jew, or could imagine a single Jew, with certain exceptions, who weren't somewhere inside themselves, whether baptized or not, somewhat uneasy. A tiny bit, there was a tiny bubble of uneasiness about how do they look on us? What do they think of us? How are we behaving ourselves? Weizmann said a wonderful thing to the Peel Commission, which bears this out. An Irishman threw a pistol at the feet of a horse on which was seated our then King Edward VIII. The horse didn't bolt, the pistol didn't go off, nothing happened. Irishman was dragged away by the police, and just an episode described in the papers. Weizmann said, when this happened, the Irish in London did not feel nervous. Supposing it had been a Jew, there's not a Jew in England who wouldn't have trembled. Other minorities can go back to their own countries if they don't like it. Jews had no country to go. Therefore, there had to be somewhere where this was not felt, where they felt naturally at home. They might produce thieves, murderers, rapists, anything you like, but not this particular kind of uneasiness, which penetrates everything.
Back in Oxford, Berlin joined a small group of young Turks who wanted to bring the rigor of science to philosophy. This movement, called logical positivism, began in Vienna and was associated with the early work of Wittgenstein. Still only in his 20s, Berlin was soon testing his wits against the toughest and brightest young philosophers of his day, A.J. Ayer, Stuart Hampshire, and the redoubtable J.L. Austin.
Austin opened by inviting me to expound a thesis. I selected C.I. Lewis's doctrine of specific, sensible characteristics, and said what I thought. Austin glared at me sternly and said, "Would you mind saying that again?" I did so. "It seems to me," said Austin, speaking slowly, "that what you have just said is complete nonsense."
1935, 36, 37, there begin to be in your rooms at All Souls a series of meetings involving A.J. Ayer, John Austin, yourself, Stuart Hampshire, a number of other key figures.
One other, two others.
And what's occurring turns out to be a revolution in British philosophy. Can you describe what happened in those meetings and why they're so important?
Well, Freddie Ayer wrote his book on logical positivism in, I think, 35. And we all read it with great enthusiasm. I read it in manuscript, made some objections to accept it. He put in quite a nice footnote with my help. But that was a liberating, I never believed in logical positivism, but it was a liberating influence.
Why liberating?
Because it swept away a lot of cobweb-like metaphysics. One didn't have to read Hegel. One didn't want to read anyway. One didn't have to read reams of continental philosophy, which seemed like some kind of secularized religion. One didn't have to read Heidegger. One didn't have to read any of these other people. Things were clear and precise and totally honest. You knew what you believed. You knew how to verify these propositions. You knew what the world was like, how to talk about it. Hugely liberating effect.
We were destroying in order to create. The dust which we swept away will not easily settle again. I believe that we set a standard of honesty and rigor which will always provide a barrier to the charlatans, windbags, and apostles of unreason whom philosophy fatally attracts.
Then I met Austin, who was elected to All Souls year after me. He was principally interested in meaning. And he thought, on the whole, that only by examining the way we use words could we tell what exactly it was we were meaning or describing. This couldn't be done by formulae. And that was genuinely homegrown. Then Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations, which nobody read till after the war, bore a certain resemblance to what Rousseau was talking about, but he didn't get it from him.
Right. Did you ever meet Wittgenstein, and if so, what happened?
Only once. That was in Cambridge. I have read the year 1940. In Oxford, you could see that even philosophers had rather sad expressions on their faces because we were doing very badly in the war. In Cambridge, there was not a sign of anybody thinking about the war at all. They lived in a very, very unworldly bubble. Then I stayed with a philosopher called Braithwaite. I said to him, we're not doing very well in the war. He said, oh, my mother always said, French forget to blow up their bridges. Doesn't matter a bit. It'll all be all right. I then read a paper on other minds. How you could tell that your headache was more violent than somebody else's. You couldn't inspect the headache. It's a singular proposition, empirical kind, relating to direct experience. But you couldn't get at the other man's experience. Nevertheless, you knew precisely what you meant. And there's no good saying, thermometers show this, and so on. There is merely evidence for it. My pain is greater than yours. My pain today is greater than it was yesterday, I could remember. But my pain is greater than yours today meant that some kind of mysterious telepathy had to occur, which wasn't available. That's what the subject of my paper was. It lasted an hour. It was not a very good paper. And a man called Wisdom, who was a famous Cambridge philosopher, began talking to me, and he said, supposing there's a lamp on the table, and inside the lamp there's a lamp on the table, and inside the lamp there was a brownie, which is how people talked in those days, but the lamp being conscious of something. And then a man I hadn't noticed interrupted. And this was Wittgenstein. He said, no, that is not the way to proceed about it. He said, let me. Everybody fell into a stunned silence. He was obviously a dictator. Extremely good looking. Young, not young, but young, sort of youthful looking, in the usual tweed jacket with leather things at the elbows, and piercing blue eyes. And he said to me, you and I will talk about, do not talk about philosophy. We'll talk about something else, yes? Let's talk ordinary business. Ordinary business, you and I. Let's begin. I say to you, well, under ordinary circs, can you imagine a clock? I said, yes, I could. You have visualized it. Yes. You have seen a minute hand which is clamped to a number on the clock face. Yes. You've seen the hour hand also clamped to another number on the same clock face. Yes. The whole clock face goes round. Yes? You see that? Yes. But the time remains the same, no? That is solipsism. It was a rather brilliant analogy. You see, it meant that the world remains exactly the same. You choose to say you invented it, but it makes no difference. So then after that we began a long discussion. I felt I was in the presence of a very demanding genius. His genius is obvious. The examples are wonderful. Half a mo, I will think of an example. Then he would think of it. And I was frightened, but I replied as best I could. Nobody else dared speak. At a certain point, my friend Braithwaite fell asleep on the floor. And Wittgenstein said, looked very sour at this, and said, suppose I say Braithwaite has decaying teeth. Braithwaite woke up and said, Wittgenstein, you said something about me. What did you say? I said, supposing I say Braithwaite has decaying teeth. You could see Braithwaite think, should I take this up? No, take it up. Fell asleep again. Let it go. At the end, he got up, shook me by the hand, said, very interesting discussion. Thank you very much. And followed by acolytes. People said, wonderful. He doesn't usually say that, you know. He obviously thinks very well of you. Splendid. And I realized exactly what he thought of me. He thought that philosophically I was rather primitive. I had not been well taught. But morally, I was okay. I didn't try and shine. I didn't try and win. I didn't behave like Freddie Eyre. I didn't try and sort of outdo him. I didn't try and catch him out in something, or maybe sort of try and find out something which he hadn't said. But exactly, I made honest answers as best I could. I was an honest seeker of the truth, and replied quite sincerely.
It was also in Cambridge at this time that he met the legendary economist John Maynard Keynes.
First time I met Keynes was in King's College, Cambridge. I was going to read a paper, philosophical paper, to the Moral Sciences Club. I was asked to dinner by Braithwaite, who was a fellow of King's, my host. He didn't put me next to himself. He put Keynes on my right and a mathematician on my left. Keynes turned to me at some point and said, "And what are you doing here?" I said, "I'm reading a paper." "To whom, may I ask?" "Moral Sciences Club." "What is it about?" Sounded awful. I said, "Pleasure." Sounded idiotic. There was a silence, and he said, "We've just eaten creme garbure," which is the name of the soup. Just as good a subject, don't you think? I felt rather put down. Then on my other side was a mathematician. So in despair, after Keynes's first boutade, I said something to him. He remained silent for, it seemed to me, but 5 minutes. Then turned back to me and said, "I do not agree with what you've just said," and fell into further silence. I must say, it wasn't a very happy dinner for me. Snubbed by both my neighbors. I next met Keynes in Washington, at dinner with Lord Halifax. This is 1944, on the eve of the re-election, fourth re-election of President Roosevelt. Keynes was there and his wife was there. His wife, as you know, was Russian, and I talked Russian to her. I got on beautifully with her. She was a child of nature, of great spontaneity and sweetness. We then sat down to dinner, and Halifax said to him, "Lord Keynes," she was then, "I know you are not a conservative. We're going to put out a document on behalf of the Conservative Party, kind of program. Would you be so kind as to look over it for us? Because you see, we don't want to talk rot." At that point, Lydia Chains got a little bit bored, and she said to me, "Do you like Roosevelt?" "Rosie. Do you like Rosie?" "I like Rosie." "Do you like him?" "Shh, Lydia, not now," said Keynes. Then she turned to me and looked at Halifax, who was sitting, I suppose, about 3 feet away from me, opposite me, and said, "Do you like Lord Halifax?" I don't think I produced a human sound. I think I produced a neighing sound. And I didn't say anything. And she said, "You know, he's very popular now. I have talked to people. Very popular. People like Lord Halifax, but it was not always so. Do you remember appeasement, Munich? It was terrible." At this point, Keynes did not stop her and enjoyed it.
Yes, yes.
And Halifax is rather embarrassed.
During the 30s, the major piece of work, you produce important philosophical papers, but the book you produce is a biography, a study of Marx. What drew you to Marx, apart from the fact that somebody assigned you to do it? What was it that held you about Marx as a project?
I thought to myself, Marxism is going to be more important as the years go on. I'd never read a word of Marx. And that Marxism was obviously a growing movement. 1933, whenever I was first asked to do it. I ought to know about it. If I don't write about Marx, I'll never read him, because I began reading him and found it incredibly boring. So I forced myself to accept this offer, and then began reading Marx in German, in English, in Russian. I read far more Marx than will ever be good for anyone else to read again. I acquired a considerable dislike for him as a human being, but I thought I knew him very well.
Do you feel you got inside his head?
Oh, yes. I knew what he was like when he came to the room. I knew what he was like when he was talking to one.
What was he like in your mind? How would you imagine Marx?
He was pompous, heavy, highly intelligent, crashing rather, made heavy German jokes, quite good, rather a bully, of a rather impressive kind. You felt in the presence of an intellectually powerful figure. who wanted to dictate to one, didn't terribly want to know what one thought, wanted you to know what he thought.
Now, the thing about the Marx book is that you produce a biography in which you get inside the head of someone who's as unlike you as it's possible to be.
I'm sure.
Now, how is it that you have this capacity to get inside the heads of
Because I'm
people
interested in people, that's all. There was a German poet in New Zealand during the war who was asked what kind of landscapes do you like best. He said, human beings are my landscape. It's entirely true of me.
By 1940, Berlin was 30, a legend in Oxford circles, but unknown to the outside world. A young philosophy don, he'd only published a couple of articles and one book on Marx. The war transformed him. In 1940, he went to America, where he spent the rest of the war. He compiled a confidential weekly report on U.S. politics and public opinion, for the cabinet in London. The timing was crucial. America was becoming the dominant world power, and Berlin made important friends, people who were later to become the architects of the post-war world. The war took Berlin out of the cloister into the great world of statesmen and power, and although he went back to Oxford after the war was over, emotionally he never really returned.
You arrive in New York in 1941, early 41, and your job is essentially to engage in propaganda that will get the Americans into the war.
It wasn't called that, and we were never told to do it.
But that's what you were doing.
That's what we were doing.
Right.
It was called British Information Services, BIS. The theory was that if anyone wanted to know anything about Britain at war, we could supply the information. The information we supplied was supplied to us by the Ministry of Information, and was therefore not the whole truth, naturally and rightly.
You had, as they say, a very good war. You go from New York, then you go to the embassy in Washington, where you compile this weekly press review of American opinion.
Not based on press entirely, based on general observation of the political scene.
Right. And this was read by the cabinet and by the upper reaches of the British Civil Service.
It went to the Foreign Office, and it was sent to the Prime Minister.
These dispatches reached Churchill, and it had one very famous result for you. It made you a famous man. Can you tell us the story?
In the spring of 1944, around March, Mrs. Churchill said to the Prime Minister of England that Irving Berlin was in London and that he'd given a very generous donation to some charity, war charity, which she headed, and that she wanted him to say something nice to Mr. Berlin and thank him for his generous gift. And Winston then had heard about me. And so then he said, no, I want him to lunch. I want him to lunch on Thursday. Well, Irving Berlin was out to lunch, was terribly thrilled. He came, Churchill turned to Berlin apparently, and he said, Mr. Berlin, what do you think is the most significant piece of work you've done for us in the last year or so? Unfortunately, Irving didn't quite understand what this meant. So he said, in a very confused way, it'll be a white Christmas. Churchill wasn't amused, thought it was a brash answer, didn't know what it meant, had never heard of a white Christmas, and there's a kind of awkward silence. And Mrs. Churchill said, you know, Winston, we ought to be very grateful to Mr. Berlin. He's given us a very generous, very generous. Generous, said Winston? I don't understand. Another silence. He then said to Mr. Berlin, presumably me still, are you an American? It's a broad Brooklyn accent. I said, why, yes, said Irving. Silence. Then, after a bit, he said, when do you think the European war is going to end? Irving said, sir, when I go back to my own country, I shall tell my children and my children's children that in the spring of 1944, the Prime Minister of Great Britain asked me when the European war was going to end. At that point, Winston became very irritated and didn't know what was going on at all. Swept his napkin up, got up and said, I am very sorry, I've got a cabinet meeting, I've got to go. Mrs. Churchill said to him, fool, I told you, wrong man. He was delighted. Having Berlin, went back to Savoy, and there he met his roommate,
Sir Alexander Korda.
Korda, and said, you know, Mrs. Churchill was a wonderful woman. I got on beautifully with her. She's absolutely marvelous. I don't know what it was about the Prime Minister. He's probably the greatest Prime Minister England's ever had. Maybe the greatest man in the world. I felt we didn't click. I don't know what it was. I just felt we didn't click.
Did you ever actually meet Churchill?
Yes, I met him properly. Only once. I mean, I met him at dinner with other people. He talked splendidly. He was talking about the next war, which he was looking forward to. We shall have to decide, he said, whether we bomb Rome or Paris. Which of these great cities is going to be blown to the dust? Rubbing his hands, I think.
This is 1946 or 7 or 8?
This is about 50.
Oh, right.
And someone said, Mr. Crossman says, Crossman, he said? Double Crossman, behind the bars with him. He said to me, who did you work under in Washington? Who is your ambassador? I said, Lord Halifax. Ah, he said, Edward, man compounded of charm. In his presence I melt. There is something that goes through him like a yellow streak. Grovel, grovel, grovel. Grovel to the Germans, grovel to the Indians, grovel to the Americans, grovel to everybody. Then he went on to other subjects and denounced the Astor family, the worst family that ever came to England. Nothing but harm. The right-wing ones, left-wing ones, all terrible. I mean, disaster. They should never have come to England, and so on. And went on this time.
Right.
They should be hanged near his tree. He then began singing about somebody being hanged for the mulberry tree. So we had a jolly lunch.
Der Stadtrand von Riga ist in deutscher Hand.
Let me ask you another thing about Washington during the war. It's in 43, 44, 45 that people become aware of what's happening to the Jews in Europe. You're a British official in the embassy in Washington, privy to lots of information and stuff. What did you know about the condition of the Jews in Europe during the war?
Nothing. When I say nothing, it's exaggerated, but what I mean is, I knew, like everybody else, they were obviously abominably treated by the Germans, and by wherever the Germans were, whatever countries they occupied. I didn't know exactly what they did. I assumed that they were imprisoned them, tortured them, killed them, but I didn't know any details. And none was reported in the British Embassy. If you lived in the British Embassy circles, I did, quite comfortably, you did not hear about this, largely because the Foreign Office tended to keep it down. They said that in order to make the BBC completely credible to the people of Europe who listened to it, one had to be quite certain of the truth and dependability of its news. Nobody could quite know what exactly was happening to the Jews. That is one reason. The BBC was told not to make too much of it. The second reason was the Arabs. They thought they didn't want to appear pro-Jewish and pro-Zionist.
But you must have, as a British official, met Zionist leaders in Washington during the war. Didn't they tell you anything about what was happening to the Jewish people?
They did not. And I cannot tell you why. I learned about the gas chambers, I would say about, it's shaming to me, about January 45, and not before. There was nothing about the American press that I saw. There probably was on page 23 of the Times. No fuss was made about it. I saw that there were demonstrations by Jews who said the trains taking people to the camps ought to be bombed. But nothing was said about the fact that extermination was going on in the camps. The camps were concentration camps. Horrors happened. The idea of mass slaughter and gas chambers, I think other people knew much more than I did. As you know, the first news came at the end of 42. There was a German officer who got to Geneva and told the Zionist official in Geneva but what was happening.
So it was known...
And it's official in Geneva, but what was happening.
So it was known as early as 42, but you don't...
43, I was ahead of 43.
You don't really
Maybe
know
late
until
42.
January 45.
But I was alone in that. I think everybody else knew more. I mean, that's very ashamed. Somehow, if it was the British Embassy, he did not mention. Nobody there ever said one word about it.
Now, you had left behind in Riga significant members of your family.
Yes.
What happened to them in the course of the war?
They were killed. There were a lot.
When?
Well, I suppose the official account, I can't tell you more than that, was they were killed in 41. That's when the Germans occupied Latvia.
And who were these relatives?
Well, I have two grandfathers. My grandmothers were dead. My two grandfathers were alive. One was blind, aged about 85. The other may have been 81. They were certainly killed. My grandfather's brother, who was head of the Jewish community in Riga, he was killed. His three daughters were killed. No, one died of cancer. Was fortunate enough to have cancer just before. Two daughters were killed. Their husbands, whom I never knew, were killed. My uncle, my mother's brother, was tortured, not just killed. He took some part in resistance and killed.
And when did you find out this news?
At the end, long after the war. I did not know it during the war, nor immediately after. Nor did my parents know anything about this.
One of the things that always puzzles me about your work is that there is a lifelong reckoning with communism and Soviet totalitarianism. But to my knowledge, there's no sustained piece of writing whatever about the extermination of the Jews and fascism and that whole abomination. I mean, it's something to which I have a sense you've just said, I don't want to write about it.
No, I couldn't write about it during the war because I knew nothing of it.
I mean afterwards.
Afterwards, I didn't write about that sort of thing. There was no point writing about it. I thought the phenomenon of fascism, as far as I was concerned, was perfectly simple. It was absolute evil. Everyone knew it to be. There was nothing in particular that I could say that 2,000 people hadn't already said, whether better or not. It didn't occur to me whether I had no opportunity of denouncing something which everybody in the world was denouncing. If you had asked me questions, I would have said what I felt, of course, bitter indignation.
There is a silence about the Holocaust in his work, but also a subterranean preoccupation which runs through his writing for the next 40 years. The fate of his people, from 1917 to the Holocaust, framed his innermost convictions. His is the darkest version of modern liberalism, the one most haunted by our potential for evil and by our fatal longing for utopias which end in slaughter.
The division of mankind into two groups, men proper and some other lower order of beings, inferior races, inferior cultures, subhuman creatures, nations or classes condemned by history, is something new in human history. This new attitude permits men to look on many millions of their fellow men as not quite human, to slaughter them without a qualm of conscience, without the need to try to save them or warn them. How have men reached such a pass?
You can see the second of these two interviews with Sir Isaiah Berlin tomorrow night on BBC Two at 11:15.
Changed back to old habits, but at that time she was perfectly free.
What did you do when you arrived?
I played God Save the King with one key on the piano, one finger. It indicated the early diversion to the new life.
You come as a complete stranger a foreigner without any English
Right.
to an English school,
To a very English school.
in suburban Surrey.
Correct.
And very quickly you get on. How can you account for your ability to swim in this new world?
I'm a natural assimilator. I think I'm naturally assimilate myself, adjust myself to milieus in which I live. This may be due to having to sort of be bundled out of one country into another. I can't explain it. All I can say is that I began playing football and cricket quite soon in the school Riga and quite enjoyed it.
When do you think you felt really at home in English? How long did that take?
I don't think I could have felt totally home in English in my first year. Although I did take part in the Christmas play of my school, which was Babies in the Wood. I was second murderer, and all...
In 1995 with Michael Ignatieff, and in accordance with the philosopher's wishes, they're being shown only now, after his death last week.
I saw a man, pale man, struggling with a lot of people, and obviously dragged him down from some top of a house from which he was presumably sniping, and obviously leading him to a very disagreeable fate. And to see a single man struggling with a lot of people dragging him to what is obviously his death is something that remained with me forever. It gave me a distaste for terrorism or violence, which remains with me to this day, no matter where it comes from, no matter how justified it might be thought to be.
As a boy of 7, Isaiah Berlin witnessed the Russian Revolution. Arguably the greatest liberal political philosopher of the 20th century, he was also present at some of the century's turning points and met many of its greatest figures: Wittgenstein, Virginia Woolf, Eisenstein, Churchill, and Kennedy. He once wrote, "A fox knows many things, but a hedgehog knows one big thing. He was a hedgehog, all his work a defense of liberty, a plea on behalf of that frightened face in the crowd." Berlin belonged to the generation of British thinkers and broadcasters who became household names in the 1950s and 60s, A.J.P. Taylor, A.J. Ayer, and Hugh Trevor Roper. But unlike these others, he was an émigré intellectual, both a quintessentially English member of the intellectual establishment and an outsider, his preoccupations rooted in his childhood years as a Jew growing up in the former Russian Empire. He was born in 1909 in Riga, in Latvia, then a province of the Russian Empire. The only child of a wealthy timber merchant, he and his family belonged to the uppermost reaches of the Jewish bourgeoisie. They'd long since left the cultural world of the Jewish ghetto, and they were thoroughly assimilated. The Berlins lived in an Art Nouveau-style apartment building in one of the most fashionable streets in Riga. As a child, young Isaiah was taken for walks in a nearby park where veterans of the Crimean War sat and took the sun. He remained in temperament and culture a Russian Jew of the last century, the last great Jewish intellectual of Tsarist Russia. In 1916, the Berlins fled advancing German armies and moved to Petrograd, later to become Leningrad, and now St. Petersburg. His experience of the 1917 revolution and of the hardship that followed under the Bolsheviks inoculated him forever against the Soviet system. All his writing can be read as a defense of the individual against the violence of the crowd and the dogma of the party line. 2 years after the revolution, the Anglophile Berlins left Russia for England. Two central elements of the young Isaiah's identity, Russian and Jewish, were in place. Now a third crucial element was to be added, his Englishness. The Berlins came to England in 1920 and settled in Surbiton in Surrey. Isaiah's love of England was colored by the moment when he first encountered it. It was the England of Kipling, King George, the gold standard, and empire. If the English took to him, it was because he offered them back an émigré's version of their favorite myths.
How much English do you speak when you arrive?
I knew Daisy, Daisy, give me your answer true. I am half crazy, all for the love of you. It won't be stylish marrieds. I can't afford a carriage. I will pronounce it. But you look sweet upon the seat of a bicycle made for two. That I knew by heart. I knew the word bicycle, therefore. I knew about 40 other English words. The first thing I did on arrival, in the morning, when we were given a delicious dish of eggs and bacon, which my family consumed without the slightest self-consciousness. So that religion...
Pretty spectacular violation of kosher laws to have bacon.
It evaporated by then. They're both what's called emancipated. Later, my mother